Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining this CARL webinar presenting the newly released Library Impact Framework, organized by the CARL Assessment Committee's Library Impact Framework Working Group. I'm Julie Morin, one of the Senior Program Officers at CARL. I'd like to start by taking a moment to acknowledge that today's panelists and attendees are joining us from the unceded territories of many Indigenous peoples who have lived and worked on this land for millennia and continue to do so today. My home and the CARL office, located here in Ottawa, are built on unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. We welcome you to add your own acknowledgements into the chat and to honor and recognize the ongoing contributions of the First Peoples of these lands. I'd also like to take this opportunity to go over the logistics for the session. Participants have been muted upon entry, and you're encouraged to type your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Links to the session slides in French and English and to the CARL Code of Conduct have been included at the beginning of the chat thread. The organizers of this webinar are committed to providing a welcoming, professionally engaging, and safe experience. If you have any questions or concerns, please contact a member of the Code of Conduct Committee for this event, whose contact information has also been listed in the chat. Finally, auto-generated captions will be enabled for this webinar, which is being recorded. Nos conférenciers répondront aux questions à la fin. Vous êtes donc encouragés à taper vos questions en utilisant la fonction questions et réponses au bas de votre écran. Les questions peuvent être posées en français ou en anglais et peuvent être traduites par le personnel de l'ABRC si nécessaire. Ce webinaire est en cours d'enregistrement. Des liens vers les diapositives de cette session en français et en anglais, ainsi que le code de conduite de l'ABRC ont été inclus au début du fil de discussion. Si vous avez des questions ou des préoccupations, veuillez contacter un membre du comité de code de conduite pour cet événement. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers for the session. Mark Robertson is the University Librarian at Brock University and Chair of CARL's Library Impact Framework Working Group. Also contributing to today's sessions are project team co-chairs Justine Wheeler, Assessment Librarian at the University of Calgary, and Tanya Gottschalk, Interim University Librarian at Thompson River University. Welcome, Mark, and without further ado, I invite you to lead our discussion today.
Thank you so much, Julie, and welcome to everyone. It's nice to see such a strong showing today, and I was just going through the names and see lots of familiar names. That's wonderful. I'm going to just start by doing a land acknowledgement for where I am. So I'm at Brock University in St. Catharines. So Brock is located on the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, many of whom continue to live here today. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the land protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. So I'm very pleased today to provide this webinar, lead this webinar with my colleagues on the CARL Library Impact Framework. I want to acknowledge the contributions of the assessment committee, but also Mary Jo Romagnoc and Shulu Betty, who are on the one of the working groups, and Tanya and Justine, who've taken a lead in this work. It's the framework is pretty fresh off the printing press or whatever it is, fresh off the press. So it came out in December, and so we're happy to. This may be for many people, maybe an orientation to something that you haven't had a chance to explore, and there may be others of you who've had a chance to kind of go in and take a look around. So I'm going to provide some background, and hold on, let me get to my first slide here. This is what we're going to be covering in this webinar. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the context and background for why we set out to do this work. We'll talk about the logic model framework upon which the CARL Library Impact Framework is based. And I don't know how many people are familiar with logic models or have used them. So I'll give a bit of an overview to what they are and how they're used in our framework. We'll talk about how the CARL Library Framework can be used, what you can actually do with it, and then we'll have some observations on the use of it. So wanted to go back to the impetus for this project. This project began quite a number of years ago in 2019. And we actually have within the CARL strategic directions one strategy that is talks about developing new indicators and approaches to demonstrating impact on research, teaching, and learning. And so that's squarely in the CARL strategic plan. And within the assessment committee, we were having discussions about how to take up this point. There's been a number of things that we've done, but we wanted to do a deeper dive into library impact. And we were aware that there were already a number of contributions from different quarters of our profession on this question. So many of, if there's assessment librarians here, which I'm sure there are, you'll be very familiar with this work. For instance, Megan Oakleaf's work on value of academic libraries. One of her key pieces was in 2010, the value of academic libraries. And then following upon that work, there was the Assessment in Action project through ACRL, starting in 2012, and whereby people from across North America were piloting particular assessment projects to look at impact. There's also ACRL's work on the academic library impact publication that came out in 2017, an influential one. And then more recently, the Association for Research Libraries has kind of similar parallel project called the Research Library Impact Framework. And that began in 2019. And similar to Assessment in Action, that involves pilot projects that actually are looking to demonstrate impact in a number of areas. So there's quite a bit already happening in this landscape, in this space, and so we wanted to make a unique contribution, not to redo that kind of work, but to come at it from a slightly different angle. And so the assessment committee, our library impact working group, we talked about some different approaches. We started with something that looked more like a literature review, and kind of served up the research that's out there on library impact as it related to different areas. We sort of started with that. Gradually, that we morphed into a conversation about a toolkit. What kind of tools would help show library impact? And then finally, it landed through a long process of evolution, landed on being a framework, which is the form you see it in now. One of our key influences, was a report by the Federation of Humanities and Social Sciences. This is linked from the framework website, which we'll look at later. But this report was undertaken by the Federation of Humanities and Social Sciences a while back, and their intent was to show the impact of humanities and social science research in non-reductive ways. And I think it came from a place where in other disciplines, bibliometrics often are used, are more central to that enterprise. But there was a feeling that didn't serve humanities and social sciences. And so this report on impact of research was looking at it through a broader frame, looking at more diverse kinds of outcomes that went beyond bibliometrics, looking at also longer timeframes. And their work recognizes that impacts can be sometimes a long way out. If you're looking at the kind of research that's happening in social science humanities, the impact can be could be collective impacts, not necessarily just individuals or particular publications, but a collective impact, and it could be 10, 15 years out in some cases. And also it has a more of an emphasis on the qualitative than you might see in other kinds of studies. And so we thought that this this approach taken by the Federation was instructive and useful. And some of the things that we were influenced by were the concept of an impact pathway, which is something they talk a fair bit about, is that sometimes the effects can be closer in at hand, but you can also trace the arc of influence, is what we've called it, from sort of more immediate impacts out to more longer term. Gets harder, of course, as further you go out, but we like that idea of tracing an arc of influence. The balance of qualitative and quantitative approaches, looking at alternatives to correlation studies and mitigating the difficulty of establishing causality. That was something that we were very aware that there's always been this kind of this desire to show causality. Often those studies show correlation, and it's hard to get around that. So we wanted to come up with something that would recognize that difficulty and not be so focused just on demonstrating causality. Yeah, so we also wanted to go beyond traditional input and output measures, make room for evidence of insight, not just causality, but insight into impact, as well as some of the more objective measures, a non-reductive approach, and an approach that allows us to tell the story of impact. So we developed a framework using logic models, and I'll go into that in a minute. And we created a series of exemplars. So the framework consists of an introduction that provides much of the kind of the concept of the framework and how it can be used. But we developed 5 exemplars, and these are the exemplars here that you see in the bullets: the library instruction, open educational resources, library learning spaces, collections and supportive research, and institutional repositories. So they're a start, but they're fairly fleshed out exemplars using logic models. And what we then did is had these peer reviewed by about 6 to 8 reviewers, some of whom may be here at the call, and if you did, then we thank you for that. And then the framework launched in December of 2021, just this past December. So I want to talk about a little bit about logic model, what the logic model is, and if there are some of you out there who are well versed and use logic models, then it's not this maybe a bit of a review, but I think it's we did notice that there isn't a lot of places in academic libraries using logic models. It is tend to be used in other kinds of context. The logic model framework is used quite commonly in the social services, I should say, rather, in NGOs and also in government. And it tends to be used in program development and evaluation. And as I say, we saw less use of it within the academic library context, which is why we thought it was so important to promote this approach. The logic model, and I'll show you graphically what this looks like. The logic model is a systematic and visual way to present and share our understanding of the relationships among the resources you have to operate your program, the activities you plan, and the changes or results you hope to achieve. Just want to pick out from this definition, this description, this idea of it being, first of all, systematic. I guess the name logic model does suggest that. It is very rigorous and forces a kind of systematic and rigorous approach, which I think is one of the things that makes it attractive. But it is highly visual as well. And so when we talk about that arc of influence, it quite literally is a map for plotting out that arc of influence. And it's an arc that runs across, and you see these bullets down below. Shows the relationships between the resources, the inputs, what we have, the activities, what we do, the outputs, what we produce, and the outcomes or impact would be the results. So why do we use a logic model for our framework? I think I've just touched on some of this. One is that it does visualize that arc of influence. That I think it's a framework that's quite holistic, and you can fit a lot into it, a lot of different ways of talking about impact. But it's very structured, and that was helpful to be able to have something that rigorous. It also articulates where we believe we have impact within our institution. So notwithstanding, sometimes it's difficult to demonstrate definitively where we have impact. This allows us to plot out where we believe that impact would lie, and then challenges us through its rigor and structure to then ask questions that help us try to show that impact. And in doing, it helps uncover beliefs and assumptions about what we think that impact is. Because it's so structured as well, it helps us tease out the input from output from impact. It helps clarify evaluation and assessment strategies, and it also creates a framework that helps us articulate what we think success looks like and how we get there. So this is really the backbone of the logic model. So this concept may be very familiar to many of you. And it's this distinction between input, which is what is invested, outputs, what is done, what do we do with those investments, and then outcomes or impact, what results from that. So it's very easy. I think the easiest part of it is to measure inputs. As you go further to the right, the more it gets more difficult. We often, though, confuse outputs and outcomes, what we do and what the results are. The other thing I wanted to, and I'll show you this in a much more fine-grained iteration in the next slide. But before I do, I just wanted to comment on, you see that third box where it says outcomes - impact. And I think there's, we sort of use those terms interchangeably often, and certainly we did when we were doing this work, kind of go back and forth between them. So I was, thinking about what is the distinction. I think what you find often is that outcomes, the results, can sometimes be fairly objective. There are things that you can actually measure and point to. But also what results can also be more subjective, and can be impacts on individuals or communities or conditions, that kind of thing. And so it has broader effects. So I was just thinking about this. I mean, an outcome of a program, this is not a library example, obviously, but an outcome could be that communities are, eating healthier, for instance. So that's an outcome. But the impact of that might be around well-being or mental health or other kinds of things that are maybe felt more subjectively. So that's one way of thinking about outcomes and impacts. But I think it's sometimes difficult to really tease those apart fully. But we will see a finer grain analysis, and in fact, that's the setup for my next slide. So this is a more fully realized logic model. So you can still recognize the inputs, outputs, and outcomes, but you start seeing it broken down more. So you'll notice that outputs gets teased into activities and what we do, and then participation, who we reach. So that's gets more fine grained there. The one I really wanted to focus on here, though, is where it says outcomes, impacts, and you see short-term, medium-term, and long-term. I think it's, in our experience, hard to really say what's short-term, medium-term, long-term, but there's another layer on this that helps us break those down. And so what you'll see there is, just partly on the screen, you'll see learning, action, and conditions in those 3 red boxes. So the way to think about that really is that learning really is about, is in effect, a change in mind. And those tend to happen before change in action. So that's more in the shorter term end of things. So for instance, changes in awareness or knowledge or attitude, skills, opinions, etc. Kind of more medium-term impact, though, would be the impact on action. So in other words, the change of behavior. So you'll see here behavior, practice, decision-making, policies. So what actually happens on the ground in terms of action. And then the hardest one, I think, is conditions. And here it says social, economic, civic, and environmental. This is what you see here is not specific to the library context. But these are really changes in environment. So the further out you go, the more permanent and lasting those impacts can be. And so that would be thought of as kind of the long-term, the longest-term impact. And we'll see examples of these when we go into one that's actually translated into a library example. The other thing I wanted to point out here are the boxes at the bottom, assumptions and external factors. We've used this framework, but we haven't used this template exactly as it appears, I mean visually, because it's hard to fit everything under these boxes, but it does get carried into our exemplars. We do talk about assumptions, and those can be the theory that the assumptions about the impact. For instance, and I'm just going to say, one of the exemplars we're going to talk about is library instruction. One of our assumptions might be that we believe that the library instruction we do is a transferable skill, for instance, into other kinds of critical thinking. So that might be something we would articulate as an assumption, and that then, I think puts the onus on us to then say, well, does that actually happen? And then how can you tell that story in terms of this structure? So that's one way, the one area where you can sort of articulate what we assume about impact. The external factors box is really about the kinds of about contingencies that may be beyond our control. For instance, enrollment or budgets or political factors within our institutions or even at higher levels. So that also is something that we carry forward into the framework. So I should just say, with this here, what you see a breakdown of inputs, outputs, and outcomes, but this view doesn't show you how you measure those things. So in our framework, in our exemplars, we've grafted onto it. We've used the same categories you see across the top, same columns, but into those columns, we've attempted to articulate. And this is just one example that we've used for library learning spaces. You can see what you would probably count for things like inputs or outputs, the kinds of things that you can measure or that you can use as evidence for impact. One of the things you'll notice is that we've put this in the second column there. We have this gradient that we've inserted between measures and insights. And that's not something that is necessarily standard in the logic model framework, but we felt it was important to put that in there because one of the things as you use the framework, we noticed is that the further right you move into outcomes, the more the impacts may be more subjective or interpretive. And so I think in correlation and causation studies, they tend to look at things that are much more objective and measurable. But we wanted to make sure that there was room for insights as well. And those can often come through quantitative measures. So for instance, in terms of library learning spaces, you might say the conditions, the kinds of impacts it has on action, for instance, or conditions, might be gained by using qualitative methods like mapping diaries would be an example, or photo elicitations, observation methods, interviews, or focus groups. So they don't have to fall onto the right side. They could be used in other areas, but there does tend to be a tendency towards the more qualitative and the more interpretive as you go to the right. So this is the landing page for the framework, and this is what I'm going to do actually at this point is this is a link in the slides. I'm going to take us outside the framework. Sorry, outside the slides, but I will take you into a logic model exemplar. You'll just notice that, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but there's an introduction. So if you scroll down into the website, you'll see a fair bit of background, and it provides a little bit of the explanation that I've given for some of these points. But there's also a button there for exemplars, so please don't miss that. And if you go in there, you'll see the more fully realized exemplars. And this is where I'm going to stop sharing the slides. I'll come back to these, but take you into a PDF of a, here we go. So hoping people can see that. I recognize it's very small text. We had to fit in a lot into these templates, but this is an example that we used for an exemplar for library instruction. So one of the things I'll just mention about what we mean by exemplars, ideally, you really need to use a logic model in your own context. That's really the value of them, applying it in your context. The exemplars are not applied in a particular context. They were ones that we developed for Carl. So they're kind of theoretical in that sense, but we felt they were really important to kind of show how you would start to populate these the framework. And so you'll see inputs, and you'll see the kinds of things that we input into instruction. And then down below, again, you see the measures and insights. And then down below, you will see strategies that we can use to try to document or tell the story of whether it's inputs, outputs, or outcomes. This is I feel like any of the exemplars, while they're very fleshed out, they could always be built on. There's going to be other ways of other strategies one could use for documenting or gaining insight into any particular impact. But this, I think, will give you some ideas of how you could use library impacts, the logic models. And then on the second page there, each of the exemplars has a definition with inclusion and exclusion criteria. So when using a logic model, it is really important upfront to define exactly what you're talking about, because sometimes the very same program or phenomena that you're looking at can have actually several different kinds of impact. And you kind of have to parse them apart and say, well, what are we doing here? What is the specific, if it's a space, like what kind of space exactly are we talking about, for what purpose, and what is the kind of impact we believe we're having in that area. So that helps to have this area where we define that. And then you can start to see that we've started to articulate some of the assumptions and questions. There might also be things that we do or don't know. And then finally, as we flesh these exemplars out, we would also want to add published studies that of approaches people have taken to showing impact. And so that just is, there's one here, but you could certainly add to those. So I'm going to stop the share screen and go back to slides. Give me a second. Okay, so we're back. So I think the link is probably provided to the impact framework, is probably provided in the chat. So if you want to look around yourself, feel free to. So a word about using the framework. As I mentioned before, the value is taking up the model for local purposes. So we didn't feel that developing a whole set of them would mean that the work was done for our community. Really, the ones we provided are really exemplars. They're examples for you to give an idea of how to do it. But for it to be meaningful, it has to be done in your particular context and speaking to the intents and the mission, your particular mission in your community. So they're exemplars only. The value, of course, is in the rigor and the structure that I mentioned, the logic model framework. I think one of the things it can force you to do as you're using the structure is that you may discover that where you think you are, in fact, where you think you are getting at impact, once you start plotting it out, you may discover that you've got some holes in your assessment strategy, and that in fact the kinds of things that you're measuring may be more on the input or output side. I think that's quite common among libraries. I think that's what's probably common in any sector, that those are the easier things to measure. And so that's a lot of the kinds of things that we have for statistical information, that kind of thing. The data can help populate some of the arc of influence and is certainly relevant, but I think in using the structure through the rigor, it may force us to kind of notice where it is that we've been able to tell the story and maybe where we have not. And that actually is, I think, once with a more fine-grained approach to outcomes that you see in this, that breaks down into learning action and conditions, you may discover that you have actually been able to get at certain aspects of impact. Excuse me. But the categories can encourage you to ask questions that maybe you haven't. How can it be used? It can be used in strategic planning, for sure, as we develop assessment strategies for strategic plans. As we develop programs, development of assessment strategies. We also, though, think that, we think about assessment, we also think about research. And so it might be the kind of thing where as a community, we use the framework and we are able to plot out areas where we have not been able to document impact or tell that story. And it can be used as well to frame a research agenda and for us to know where the questions lie. We also thought about the framework as a framework that can be used to collate, collect, and share Carl Library impact initiatives. So what we're hoping, and one of my last slides is around this as a living framework, we're hoping is that as a community, we're able to use this shared approach and then collect as a repository, use the framework as a repository to collect examples of logic models from across our institutions. And of course, you can also use logic models as for evidence-informed decision-making. So these are some of the kinds of uses. This link here, Enhancing Program Performance with Logic Models from the University of Wisconsin, I highly recommend this, and this is linked from the framework on the web. And it's quite an extensive workbook that was used, appears to have been used for an online course. And so it's one of the most detailed kind of explanations of how to use a logic model and all the different pieces of it. So we have linked to that as a resource. So if anyone's interested in, I think as you start to use it, it provides really helpful guidance. So I'm going to invite Justine and Tanya if they can take the next couple slides. And the next couple slides are about the use of the framework and the use of the model. And both Justine and Tanya have a fair bit of experience developing exemplars. So I'll turn it over to the two of you.
Okay, I think I'll start and Tanya will jump in. First of all, just a quick note that we did start, as mentioned, with looking at toolkit, and we've listed the people at the end of this presentation who were involved in that. And they did a ton of deep work. And one of them is here today, Carissa, so thank you for coming. And so we want to acknowledge that and say a lot of our thinking and our discussions was helped Tanya and I map that over into some of the logic models that we created, because Tanya and I were tasked with creating the exemplars and then sending it to the other group for feedback. So I just put that out there. And one of the things that Tanya and I quickly found, which I think Mark has already commented on, is that it's very easy for library workers to come up with metrics and outputs and who our community is. But as we moved further along in the continuum towards insight into real societal change, it became much more difficult to fill out these. And I think, depending on your research question, it really benefits from having domain experts. So for instance, if you want to look at a question about indigenizing your library collection, we would certainly want to see Indigenous librarians or people who are experts in that field, Indigenous collection librarians be a part of that. We also listed, as Mark mentioned, some questions at the end of the, along with the assumptions and criteria. And one thing we did find is we were providing broad exemplars, but I think these logic models would work well with very specific questions and very specific user groups. So any one of those questions could be taken and made into their own logic model. The other thing we really liked about it is that it does acknowledge different universities' systems. So it doesn't try and put a value on what is impact or what should be important. It's for every university, college, academic institution to decide what's important. And if I think back to our work on the toolkit, we did have one member who was from a French-speaking university, and he would always remind us that for them, one of their main goals was how they were contributing to the Francophone community. So I think it does a very good job of allowing people to set their own values and then look at the impact of that. Do you want to comment on that, Tanya, at all?
No, not really. I think you've covered everything really well there, Justine. Thank you.
No problem. So those, and we have some other observations, of course, that can be used for planning and development. We are thinking about it for assessing, but in fact, it does have a lot of the elements that you would look at when you were doing a research design project or a strategic plan. So it can be used to think about what are your priorities and what do you want to put effort into. And along with that, one of the things I like about the model is not all institutions have the same amount of resources. Some don't have assessment librarians or a lot of extra effort. So you can look at the model and think, okay, we only have the resources to go this far on all of these. So what are our real priorities? What are we going to really put our effort into to move all the way into showing impact, which will take more effort and time. So we enjoyed all of that. I think we can go to the next slide. Who's moving? Oh, there we go. The whole point of this slide is just to say that the one thing we didn't love about the logic model is it makes it look like it's very linear, that you're just going from one side to the other. This gives you an example that in fact it's more circular, and in fact if you've ever seen Kuthal's model for information literacy, it's quite iterative, that you can go back and forth. You can go from library mission to thinking about your outputs to thinking about your strategy. When you do the actual model, you've got to be a little more logical and analytical about it, but it is not we start at one end and go to the other, and there's no changing things as you go along, because we all realize that context changes everything. And the next one. All right, so we sent these, as Mark mentioned, out for peer review to assessment librarians, and these are some of the comments that we got back. People seem very excited. And I will note on the comment about the living framework, we're really hoping that people will put exemplars into the CARL website, and I think Mark will talk about that more, about what they've been doing, and that we can share work with each other and build on what we've done so far. I think that's about all, unless you want to add anything, Tanya, any experiences, anything?
No, I think it would be wonderful if we got some people using it and seeing some real live, exemplars. They're like not exemplars, but actual use of the framework. So.
And someone in chat has mentioned that the Canadian Evaluation Society offers training in logic models. I'll also say that Library Juice does as well. I think Jennifer Sweeney, who's a US librarian, provides some training. And we're hoping actually to do some workshops on logic models as well, and do some Canadian context and work on these models. So with that, I think I'll send it back to Mark.
Okay, thanks, Justine and Tanya. So just before I go to the next slide, I want to just kind of pull out that last quote, one of the ones we got from our peer reviewers. We had talked, within the framework, within the introduction, it talks about it being a living framework. And so this comment I thought was interesting. I'm curious about how the concept of it being a living framework will be supported. Will the framework reside in an online location where its continued development will be crowdsourced? I think there'd be a lot of value in doing that. So, oops, just a minute. Sorry, the forward button sometimes disappears on me. So we wanted to end off on a slide on this idea of it being a living framework. As I mentioned, really the value of this is in actually taking it up and doing that work of applying it. And so obviously we've taken a stab at it, and we've given examples of how it can look, but we also had thoughts about it having an ongoing life. So for instance, and these are just a couple different kind of trains of thought that we've had, and we're very open to other approaches to this question. But we've talked about the possibility of developing a community of practice. So if, and that may actually relate to the second bullet as well about professional development. So I like the reference to the Canadian Evaluation Society, and we've talked about maybe bringing in someone to do training through CARL, to having a kind of more sustained workshop, or possibly through the Canadian Library Assessment Workshop, your CLAW. Could happen in a number of different ways and venues, but as we learn together about how to use this approach, that opens up opportunities for us to have a community of practice around how we apply this in our own context and support each other. The other possibility I think that's we've talked about as we've gone through this is having call for submissions, and there's really two kinds of things here. One is exemplars, and again, the exemplars are not specific to a particular context. So they're really examples of what it can look like kind of in the abstract as applied to a particular program or area. So it could be that I think we could develop more. We have a handful, but we could develop more. And so there could be call for submissions for particular communities who have deep expertise in a particular area to develop one together and provide it as an exemplar. But the other way would be for just actual applications and to collect those as a repository, so that we can see how each of us has applied it and what those logic models have looked like. And that's, I think, quite instructive, because it starts to, for instance, if you were able to articulate what the strategies are that you've used to gain insight or measure, to tell the story of impact of a particular program or resource, I think we can learn a lot from each other by seeing the strategies we've used, but also looking across them and saying, you know what, we've not been very effective at telling this part of the story, this part of the picture. And that could also inform a collective research agenda as well. So those are just a couple sort of themes that we've started to pull out in terms of this question of how we might make this into a living framework. So I want to just end up on this slide, and Justine was talking about all the different people who have been involved in this work. There's actually been two groups. So first is the Library Impact Working Group. That's been me and Mary Jo Romaniuk and Shalou Betty, who's here with us. Hi, Shalou. And Julie from Carl. And so we're the Impact Framework Working Group that's been working through the Carl Assessment Committee. But Justine and Tanya have also they've co-chaired the Library Impact Toolkit project team, and others have joined them for this work at various stages of this project. It did evolve as we went along, but so you'll see contributors here that it really helped shape where it's landed. So wanted to acknowledge the enormous amount of work over a long period of time that this has taken. And I think with that, this is the last slide. So we're open to questions and answers that people may have, or just observations.
Well, we do have one question, or a couple of questions from Robin Bergart. And it was, well, first, congratulations, but she has a few questions. One is that logic model name is quite vague. Had we thought about using a more descriptive name? Two, do logic models feel like a natural step from the originating Shirk report? Absolutely. We can talk about that. They seemed much less structured than logic models. And are academic libraries in Canada using logic models successfully? And 4, did the group come across how logic models, oh, there's 5 questions, are embraced or resisted in organizations, and how to address challenges, and how does this work with creating an assessment plan? Well, I'm not sure we can answer, I could answer a couple of them. I'm not sure there are academic libraries in Canada currently actively using logic models. We didn't see any in our literature review. As far as it being a vague name, I agree, but I think it's the name of the process. Public libraries, Kimberly Silk has said, use logic models. So absolutely. And do you want to step in for some of the other questions?
Sure. I don't know. In terms of the Shirk report, that was actually the Federation of Humanities and Social Sciences. They would have been a natural step for them. I'm not sure. There's actually our VPR here at Brock was one of the authors on that report. I'd be interested to kind of have that conversation with him and see what he thinks. But they took a different approach there. If you look at that report, what you'll see is that they developed case studies. So it's a much more narrative approach, and it isn't as structured as this. But they will take one of the ones I remember is, what is the one of their case studies was, what is the impact of folklore studies? That was just the example. And they tell a story of the impact of that work and that research at a societal level. But it's a much more narrative approach, but it's still getting at that kind of arc of influence over a long period of time. And through a sort of a collective approach of that research, as opposed to an individual paper or individual researcher. Whether they could use something like this, I think it tends to be applied for programs and resources sort of organizationally. I'm not sure. Possibly it could be used for research. I'm not quite sure. I'd have to try it out conceptually. What's the last, the other ones here? Did the group come across logic models are embraced or resisted in organizations, and how to address challenges? As I think Justine said, we didn't see a ton of application of them in an academic context. So I guess that's a question for all of us, is in taking this up, are there ways that it really fits well, or are there areas of friction where there are limitations to the model? I think one of the things that Justine mentioned is it looks like a very linear model. It looks like you have to read it from left to right, like that's just that's an artifact of the template. We did struggle with things like that. There may be ways in which or other kinds of analyses that other kinds of critiques one could make of the approach.
I'd also add, I don't think there would be that much resistance to a logic model. It would be more to assessment culture or change or things like that, because the logic model isn't the outcome or the impact, it's what you're doing. So it's just one way at getting at it. And how does it work to create an assessment plan? Well, I would think that you would, and I'm just guessing, you would have your strategy, your priorities, and then you would use the model to look at how you might achieve or assess in those areas. So that would be my guess, but I'm open to other people chiming in.
Kimberly has a number of comments in the chat. What we call logic models, that's what they are called in the evaluation sector, and it's best for us to adopt the nomenclature and not create our own name for them. Adopting evaluation is a journey for libraries. It's worth learning how to do this so we can effectively demonstrate our value to stakeholders, inform strategic planning, and support advocacy and assessment. In developing a culture of evaluation is a process, a journey.
So are there other questions or comments? Sorry, Mark, just butted in there.
We did a version of this presentation at OLA, and one of the questions was about whether you could use this for when you're doing strategic planning. So I think the answer is yes, but I think one of the things that conversation drew out is that the sort of linear approach to it. Let me just go back a number of slides. Yeah, so I think if you were starting with an existing, so let's just say program or service, you probably, it's already in existence, you're probably looking at, thinking kind of left to right here, the inputs, the outputs, the outcomes. I think if you are working with a strategic plan, you don't have your tactics yet. I mean, well, it's part of the process of a strategic planning process. But you are starting with higher level goals, which tend to be really about you're starting with the impacts that you want to have, and then you're working backwards. And so that's where I think this idea of it being cyclical or circular really comes into play. That you can read this from left to right or right to left, and your starting point in all of this, it can be as high as what is the strategy for the university, and then thinking about then what are the impacts we want to have, and then working backwards to your input, output, outcome, rather than looking at existing programs and trying to work your way up to connecting to the university mission. So just wanted to point that out, that one, although it's linear, you can kind of read it different ways and use it for strategic planning or for program evaluation.
And if I could just add that, there is still quantitative methods or metrics or descriptive statistics that certain organizations and your university or college might want, but it does acknowledge the microcosm that is libraries and universities and allows you to move to looking at something holistic with many variables, which is, an interpretive or qualitative methodology, depending how you do it. So there's room for both, which I think is very useful.
Ron notes that he likes this approach to developing ideas to help institutions find their way through these jungles. Not all elements or measures may be applicable, but it may offer some ideas to start.
And that's the other thing. These are just examples. They are not in any way comprehensive.
And Kimberly writes, yes, the logic model accommodates qualitative and quantitative methods. And I think that's really key. And that's this slide here. This is such an important, I think an important thing for us is that, one of the starting points of the discussion was some disillusionment with this, how talking about impact always ends up with this kind of supposed gold standard of the causation study. And then that opens itself up to the critique of, well, how do you actually get a causation? Aren't we talking about correlation? And you get caught in this kind of vortex of in that discussion. And so we while that's all true, we thought that actually one of the attractive things about the model is that it in some ways helps us break out of that. It isn't about proof necessarily. If you're after proof, then qualitative approaches that are seeking insight may not be satisfying that approach. But I think the model as a whole opens it up itself, in a holistic way to finding a place for the measures, for the data, for the qualitative approaches, for the more interpretive approaches, and together all of those things, they work together to tell us the overall story of what we're actually up to and the kinds of impacts that we're having or that we are aspiring to. And so I think it's quite a flexible model.
So I think we're running out of time, but Natalie has a question, which is, given that students are very similar at all institutions, that most libraries have similar programs, and that the most difficult part of the process is to determine what the medium and longer term impacts are, could logic frameworks be used to generalize the outcome if activity X is done well and to identify the elements actions required in order to do activity X well? So I think what you're saying is, could it be used for best practice or evidence-informed decisions if you can't do the whole process yourself? And probably, I think I would guess that it would be like reading an article where someone has done something you want to do. You can take their example. It's not going to be exactly the same, but you can certainly read it and glean what you can from it. Mark, Tanya?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot that one can learn from each other's attempts to apply this. But I think the local circumstances are quite important as well. And so we ran up against this a little bit when we're doing exemplars. For instance, the one on institutional repositories. You can do it we did do it at a high level, but we did have to make some decisions and say, okay, this is actually about a particular kind of impact, knowing that institutional repositories can be used for different things at different places. And sometimes it ends up being more like, there's an aspect of digital asset management in there that's not about dissemination of public research. It has other kinds of things baked into it, preservation layers or things like that. And so sometimes one thing may look like one thing, but in different context is actually slightly different and is doing different kinds of things. And so I think that's it's important to tease that out as well. It looks like we're at time. So we're really gratified that we had such a great number of people showing up for this. Thank you for coming, and we're really open to your feedback and comments, and particularly on ways that we can make this most useful and as a living framework. Julie, did you have some closing
Yeah,
remarks?
so I see that we're losing people quite quickly and we are over time, so I'll just be very brief. I just wanted to thank our presenters today. So Mark, Justine, and Tanya, not just for the insights provided today, but for all of your hard work developing this resource. I know a lot went into it. I'd also like to thank all of our participants for attending and invite you to keep an eye out for upcoming CARL webinars. So thank you again, everyone, and have a great week.
Thanks, everyone.